few people in pro-estrogen groups said that you don't have to manage it, but you're dealing with erectile difficulties, maybe this is the video for you. What's up, everybody? It's your boy Ryan, and this is the Thunder Channel. On nootropics, on testosterone, and on male performance. Subscribe to the channel if you're into that stuff. Hit the bell to get notified of all future content. A couple coupon codes for product. Number one, coupon code 15NOW will save you 15% on the Torque nootropic stack or the Cortex stack. Those are our nootropics. You can get them at livecortex.com. Secondarily, if you want to learn about nootropics, we have a ton. We have basically a litany of information ranging from full-on books to teach you how to use nootropics properly to courses, etc. And again, you can do all that stuff at livecortex.com. All right, so I want to start this discussion by saying, yes, if you're not managing estradiol on TRT and you've read on Reddit that you don't have to manage it, and suddenly many years of established endocrinology and general practice around this has just, gone by the wayside, and we're just going to ignore all that because a few people in pro-estrogen groups said that you don't have to manage it, but you're dealing with erectile difficulties, maybe this is the video for you. Look, the bottom line is, and some of the major points I'm going to make, which are all backed by literature, is that estradiol at certain capacities is going to inhibit erection function, right? Past a certain range, which is going to be different for different guys, you are going to have lackluster boners, especially when you're on TRT. If you're injecting exogenous testosterone, then a good degree of that testosterone, depending on a variety of factors, is going to convert to estrogen. It isn't something that you need to just leave by the wayside because the internet says so. So I'm going to break down some literature on this so that you understand at the vascular level what the estrogen binding to estrogen receptors does in the penis, and specifically inducing erectile dysfunction. But first, I'm going to take you to a video of a couple of the guys that are actually responsible. There's a group of people that are responsible for pervading this message of you don't need to manage estrogen on TRT. Here are a couple of them. It generally comes from the TRT and hormone optimization YouTube channel, which, by the way, does have good information. I think what these guys did that was really good is bring to light the negatives of high dosing aromatase inhibitors and crushing your estrogen, which is something you definitely don't want to do. But I mean, like with titles like why you don't have to worry about estrogen on TRT, it's extremely misleading. This is the kind of stuff that, though one of these guys, I think the guy on the right is an actual doctor, you should not be putting out on the internet. I don't care who you are or who you think you are. You shouldn't be saying like this. Anyway, so let's get to this video and then react to it.
E2 and bone health. Is he referring to free E2?
You're always referring to free. We don't really, you have to remember that circulating serum estradiol, being an intracrine hormone, is not really that essential like testosterone, because testosterone in men is an endocrine hormone. Now, the difference is that endocrine hormones are produced by a gland and they're secreted into the bloodstream for systemic circulation. So they act throughout your whole body, even though they're produced in one specific area. When we introduce an exogenous testosterone into the bloodstream, we are replacing that endogenous endocrine hormone, but it's still a systemic hormone. It is not produced within cells. It enters the cell from systemic circulation. With an intracrine hormone, this is something that is converted inside of the cell by the aromatase enzyme from testosterone. So the cells and within the tissues, the target tissues that utilize your estradiol are essentially converting testosterone over and making enough estradiol for themselves. And once those receptors are saturated, any excess would then be excreted back into the bloodstream for excretion via urine. 85% of estrogen in men is excreted via the urine. So I expect to see guys with TRT with elevated serum estradiol levels, but those are meaningless. So don't take too much stock into your estradiol levels, whether they're free or total. Yes, SHBG does have a binding effect to estradiol, not nearly as strong as it does to androgens. So don't worry about estrogen in the least bit if you're doing everything else correctly.
Okay. So a couple things that I want to discuss here. Now, what these guys are referring to as far as estrogen being an intracrine hormone, yeah, got it. Totally fine. But what this doesn't mean is that the serum is meaningless. Now, that's the statement that I believe his name is Gil made toward the end of that video, that you don't really have to be focused on the serum levels of estradiol, that they are meaningless. This is not true. And I'm going to get to some pretty conclusive, pretty convincing. I mean, there's really no refuting this research on serum levels of estradiol and how that's affecting smooth muscle tissue, vascular function via the estrogen receptors that are in the penis. So stick around for that. But I want to quickly cut to another one of these guys from the TRT and hormone optimization channel, which has been kind of over the last 3 or 4 years or however long, putting out this information not to manage estrogen and to let it go as high as necessary. Sure, manage manage estrogen in your diet and in terms of the consumption of cruciferous vegetables and modifying your either injection type, frequency, or your dose of TRT. Got it. That's great that they suggest those kind of things. However, the general tone and the takeaway that guys get from it, and based on their own words and how they title their videos, is that you don't need to manage estrogen on TRT or in general, and that is wrong. And this is one of the star players of this camp, a guy named Danny Bossa, who recently, I guess, did a video and said, hey, I'm not going to talk about TRT anymore. He's gotten a lot of blowback, right? The guy's gone out there. I respect him that he's gone out and said, hey, this is what I think. This is what I have come to learn through the research. And apparently he has clients that he works with, or maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. I really don't actually know. They've done, again, a good job at highlighting the pitfalls of aromatase inhibition and particularly, crushing your estrogen. And they're obviously referring to some of the older bone mineral density papers on women that don't have high levels of testosterone that had breast cancer that were taking 7 milligrams of anastrozole a week and had between 5 and 7% or so bone mineral density loss over a 5-year period in the lumbar spine and the hip. All good. Totally got it. However, this video is titled Stop Managing Estrogen on TRT. So let's get into it.
That I would use one little analogy for something that comes up a lot that I've been a very passionate proponent of. So I'm going to give you that analogy right now, because if I give you that analogy, if I never make a video again, I'll say I've officially exhausted every single possible way for me to explain what's going through my mind here. All right, so the analogy is as follows, and I really want you guys to follow this as closely as you can. All right, my swimming pool has a leak. So last night I took this cup and I put it where the leak is, and I let the water leak into the cup overnight. In the morning, I picked up the cup and I looked inside, and there was about 400 ml of water, dirty water. I want to ask you guys, how much water do I have in my swimming pool? Can any of you explain to me how much water I have in my swimming pool? Because I've been very clear. I have 400 ml of water that leaked into the pool. That you realize there's no way for you to know how much water is in my pool based on how much has leaked into a cup.
Okay, now the point he's trying to make is you can't tell how much estrogen is binding at the receptor site based on the serum, and that's largely true, right? I mean, you don't have a good glimpse into estrogen at in cardiac tissue and in the brain and in penile tissue at binding to the receptor sites. We have no idea. I don't think that that's anything new. So let's continue on a part where he discusses protocol and this notion that you can just manipulate your TRT protocol and do some dietary interventions, and this should manage your estradiol and you don't have to be concerned about it thereafter. Where he basically goes on to disparage, well-read, well-studied, highly educated, very experienced doctors and endocrinologists.
To do this. Who? Well, my doctor, blah, blah, blah. 3 milligrams of Arimidex. Injections every 10 days or every 2 weeks. And even the doctors that are doing this incorrectly, we contact them. Trust me, we do. And we say, what you are saying is false. Here is evidence. Can you back up what you're saying with any evidence? Because I know you can't. And needless to say, they never write you back. Or they do, and they say, well, every time we give a guy an AI, they feel better. I don't give a shit if they feel better, because you're basically destroying their health. And if you just made some simple little tweaks to their protocol, which you've done over 1 million times, that would be it. And you wouldn't need the damn AI.
Okay, so I just have to shut that off because my brain is overwhelmed with misinformation at this point. First of all, obvious disparagement of, established medical practice, established endocrinological practice regarding TRT, and, what doctors think about, basically prescribing AIs to men that are on TRT. There are a couple false statements there. Number one, the idea of giving an aromatase inhibitor to a man is destroying their health. This is not true. Now, there's a number of different fallacies built into, their whole ideology, but specifically that point that AIs are going to destroy your health, they're usually referring to these studies that were done on women that had breast cancer that were taking 1 milligram of anastrozole daily, which again, over the course of a 5 to 7 year period, resulted in a 5 to 7% reduction in bone mineral density in the lumbar spine and the hip. Now, these are cancerous postmenopausal women that are not on testosterone, that have crappy bone mineral density as it stands, that were taking very, very ultra high doses of anastrozole, which you really wouldn't need to take on TRT. Secondly, we're looking at my labs, and these were recently done. The lipids are what some of the anti estrogen control folks are typically referring to that are going to get skewed, as Danny said, destroying your health. These are my labs. I use a very, very minute dose of an aromatase inhibitor. It's an anastrozole. It's almost negligible, but it's enough to keep E2 in a perfect balance considering my testosterone dose. I feel amazing, but when my E2 goes past a certain level, I start having erection issues, and I'll get to that. But yeah, there's no destruction of my health whatsoever. I mean, there's hemoglobin A1C. I have a bunch of other biomarkers, and my health is in like a really great place, especially lipids. That's because, whether or not you're using an AI is not the only thing that goes into how your lipids are. I mean, there's plenty of other things that you could be doing supplementally and otherwise to make sure your lipids are in a great place. Now I want to cut to Derek from MPMD and his experience with high versus low estrogen, just to give you an idea of what it feels like as far as erectile function goes and otherwise when you have high estrogen, and also what it feels like when it's low. So I'm not trying to make the point that you should squash your estrogen and it should be very low. It's got to be managed and in a very particular range, which is going to be different for different guys. Let's cut to Derek.
Anyways, as far as how I feel when I have high estrogen, for me, if my androgen levels are sufficient, which they almost always are because I can manually adjust them with exogenous TRT, unless I'm doing some weird experiment with like injectable SARMs or something, which I'm not going to be doing anymore. But anyways, my libido is fine. The problem is erectile dysfunction, and it's very obvious when you're like trying to get hard. It's like very hard to stay hard, and this is even with PDE5 inhibitors. If your estrogen is way too high, you'll know this if you've taken a cycle before and you've used way too much test, or you've used test with D-ball or something, or anything that could exacerbate aromatization potentially, or increases the expression of aromatase, or you just have a mismanaged balance of your hormone profile. Having a high estrogen level, even when you have high androgens, if your estrogen is way too high, you end up in a position where your libido is good, but your dick just doesn't work. Even if you slam a bunch of Viagra and Cialis, it's still not functioning even where it would be normally if you were not in this position. So that is, to me, my number one sign is libido. Like, obviously everyone has their own sign. Some people are going to notice, oh, my blood pressure goes up. Some people are going to say, oh, I get watery, and somehow they can tell just by water retention. For me, the sign is my dick doesn't work, my morning wood is gone, but my libido is high still. Now, as far as the sweet spot,
okay, so let me just quick interject and say that's exactly the experience that I have and the experience that most guys have. Now, a lot of guys that are on Reddit following this advice to never manage estrogen end up with erectile problems. They write about it on Reddit. They're experiencing it, home in isolation by themselves and can't have sex with their wives and whatever. But the dogma, this is where dogma comes in, and this whole pro-estrogen group is a real issue out there, comes in, and it's like, to them, you don't want to manage estrogen. To them, you don't want to lower estrogen. To them, it's the most unhealthy thing in the world to lower estrogen. What I'm going to get to in some literature here in a sec is what Derek said, which is erection problems, right? Your morning wood's going to go away for the most part for most folks that estrogen's past a certain range for them, and that's going to be, again, different for different guys. Generally, it's going to be harder to maintain an erection, and the mechanism of action for this is estrogen receptors in the penis. You actually have vascular inhibition of erections, I believe at the penile base. Again, I'm going to get to that literature when E2 is past a certain point, and that is literally via the estrogen that came, again, from the serum, which is supposed to be meaningless according to the pro-estrogen folks. Now let's talk about crashed estrogen.
100 cold approaches to like create that rotation, and then I just like blew it up because I didn't give a fuck anymore because my estrogen was in the ground. Like, that's the kind of thing crashed estrogen does to you. Not only does your dick not really work, you just don't give a fuck. It was like, at that point, my penis literally, the only function it served was urinating. That was like, I didn't give a shit about anything at that point, and I completely blew up all the relationships I was in, and I did my show and blah, 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 and like I dried out and like, great. But like, you pretty much become asexual when your estrogen is like crashed into the ground.
Now, what I want to do is I want to take you right to some literature to convey this point of, yes, if you're on TRT and you're pumping out you're making a lot of estrogen from your testosterone and you're having erectile issues, but you're in the pro-estrogen group, I feel for you. I understand how this kind of pervades people's minds and tricks people into believing that you don't want to manage estrogen at all because you're going to have a heart attack at 50 or whatever. Now I'm going to rattle off a bunch of different literature and actually give you the sources so that you can go and follow up on this and read all this stuff and, you know, find out for yourself. This is a paper titled The Association Between Elevated Serum Estradiol, which is supposed to not matter according to the pro-estrogen guys, and clinically significant erectile dysfunction in men presenting for andrological evaluation. Now, the basic relevant part of this summary is among 256 patients, average age was 49 years old, average serum estradiol was 22.3 picograms per milliliter, and average serum total testosterone was 465.9 picograms per milliliter. On multivariate logistic regression, serum estradiol was associated with clinically significant erectile dysfunction when controlling for serum total testosterone. They go on to say these results warrant future studies on the utility of measuring serum estradiol in patients with erectile dysfunction, the use of aromatase inhibitors in patients with erectile dysfunction, and elevated serum estradiol. On another very, very long, exhaustive piece of literature titled Effect of Estradiol on Penile Erection, a Cross-Sectional Study, there's a very important part that I want folks to understand. And actually, we should just read this entire paragraph. Estradiol in animal models impedes normal penile development and can cause a reduced bulk of the bulbospongious muscle, reduction of the spaces in the corpus cavernosum, and accumulation of fat cells within existing spaces that lead to ED in adult life. Got it, right? Expose them to estrogen early, that's going to fuss with penile development. Expose them to estrogen thereafter, not so much, once it's already developed. They go, in addition to the influence on the structure, estradiol has a considerable influence on penile vasculature. Estradiol can increase venous vascular permeability via vascular endothelial growth factor, which is VEGF, and has, not maybe has, or potentially has, or can have, has a detrimental effect on erectile function through increased venous leakage. If you guys want to check out that study and then go follow the, the reference study, go for it. So basically what that's saying is exposure to estradiol is going to lead to, at certain levels, increased venous leakage, which is going to lead to ED. But to that same paper, just a element of the paper which is really important here for our purposes, that says the following: evidence from animal models demonstrates this independent role of estradiol in erectile function. Stimulation of ER receptors, this is estrogen receptors, has been shown to have anti-apoptotic effects on endothelium, and the loss of this function in the crura was associated with ED. Similarly, when ED was induced by high estradiol levels, testosterone therapy did not help restore erections as long as the estradiol milieu was maintained. They go, while animal models have not provided conclusive evidence and the pathophysiology of erection function is more complex than simple hormone differences, which it is, these findings provide an interesting and compelling initial step in elucidating estradiol's separate and direct effect on ED outside of its role in testosterone suppression. This is actually a very important paper, which was just referenced by the previous paper in that point of when estrogen is maintained at a certain level, not even testosterone therapy alleviates the erectile dysfunction that these rats are having. It goes like this. Some studies suggest that high estrogen levels lead to erectile dysfunction. High estrogen levels are known to decrease testosterone levels. This is true. However, no study has examined whether testosterone replacement can improve the ED induced by high estrogen levels. They measured a smooth muscle function via isometric tension and erectile function by measuring the intracavernosal pressure. This is relating to the smooth muscle in the penis. In the ES group, which is the estrogen treated group, the contraction of the corpus cavernosum smooth muscle increased in response to noradrenaline, and its relaxation decreased in response to the nitric oxide donor sodium nitroprusside. Further, the erectile function was significantly decreased in the ES plus TE group. So this is estrogen, them giving them estrogen as well as administering exogenous testosterone. Neither smooth muscle function nor erectile function was significantly improved. In conclusion, a high estrogen milieu affected erectile function in rats, and testosterone treatment did not improve the ED caused by high estrogen levels. When you think about ED, venous leakage typically comes up, and I referenced this in some of these other studies that were essentially referencing what ultimately was this study, which shows us that venous leakage is influenced very largely by estradiol concentrations. At the end of this abstract, they conclude, our data support the hypothesis that the steroid environment, in particular estradiol level, can influence venous vascular tone via VEGF or NO, thus affecting venous leakage dysfunction. This point can explain a possible link between the high estradiol levels and a functional insufficiency of the venous system in ED. Oh, by the way, these were not rats. These were people. These were patients. So if you want to read that paper, please go read that paper. Lastly, I want to point you to a paper called Genesis of Prolactinomas, Studies Using Estrogen-Treated Animals, where basically they were administering estrogen, which is not exactly estradiol, but it's nearly molecularly similar in terms of its structure. It's the estradiol that they give you when they're treating you, right? It binds right to the E2 receptors. It mimics regular estradiol. A lot of people like to make the argument that because it's not regular estradiol, that this is why it causes these issues. I beg to differ. I'm not going to read the entire study for you. You should go read it if you want to, but ultimately the conclusion is that there are estrogen receptors on the lactotropes that are in the pituitary gland which produce prolactin. And when they gave, in these cases, estrogen-treated animals continuous estrogen, guess what happened? The lactotropes overexpressed and they developed pituitary tumors. There are E2 receptors in your lactotropes. Those are the cells that make prolactin in your pituitary gland. All right. Relevant element of this paper is lactotrope sensitivity due to the mitogenic action of estradiol has important implications in normal physiology. During pregnancy, estradiol levels are elevated, which causes an increased number of lactotropes and increased plasma PRL or prolactin, which is necessary for the initiation of milk production. When the level of estrogen returns to basal levels, the mitogenesis of the lactotrope ceases. Got it. If estradiol levels remain elevated for prolonged periods, tumor formation can result. Although prolactinomas are quite common in the human population and are readily induced in animal models, our knowledge of the formation of these tumors is limited. The data presented in this review indicate that estradiol exposure may lead to prolactinoma formulation via orchestrated events involving dopamine D2 receptors, TGFB isoforms, and the receptors, as well as factors secondary to TGFB action. These data demonstrate that estradiol suppresses the dopamine D2 receptors, signaling in lactotropic cell proliferation. I'll just get to the end so that you can get the kind of takeaway. Taken together, these studies further understanding that not only TGFB action in the anterior pituitary, but also of the etiology of estradiol-induced prolactinomas. Basically, what they're saying is elevated levels of estradiol are modifying the lactotropes via D2 in interaction with the D2 receptors, of which the pituitary gland contains many, and ultimately prolonged estrogen exposure led to the formulation of pituitary tumors. If you need any further confirmation of estrogen's role in the formulation of tumors in your pituitary, which will end up inhibiting LH and FSH secretion and cause hosts of other issues, not the least of which are cardiovascular issues, you can go to a paper called Anastrozole as an add-on therapy for cabergoline-resistant prolactin-secreting pituitary adenomas, real-life experience in male patients, in which they basically reached a point of resistance with a dopamine D2 agonist on a prolactinoma, which is a pituitary tumor that is secreting prolactin, where the D2 agonist cabergoline did not work anymore, right? A resistance to cabergoline. It was not shrinking the tumor or lowering serum prolactin after a certain period. This is called resistance. Then a milligram a day, which I admit is a high dose, and this is a very complex situation, a unique situation to be in, but a milligram a day of anastrozole was added to the dose of cabergoline for a year, and in all cases, then the prolactin levels started to reduce again, as well as the tumor size decreased in all cases, okay? Highlighted all cases. Interestingly, in this study, no severe adverse effects have been reported. A moderate weight gain has been observed in 2 cases. They go on to say the addition of an aromatase inhibitor to dopamine agonist therapy improved the control of prolactin levels and induced tumor regression. Why is this? Because estradiol plays a heavy role in modifying the D2 receptors and facilitating lactotrope function in the pituitary gland, which eventually could lead to the formulation of tumors. I mean, you're using estrogen reduction to reduce the size of the tumor and the prolactin levels. Now, lastly, look, there's a ton of other research on this, and this is a discussion or an argument that could go on for at least 3 hours. I'm going to take you to a Reddit post which in the testosterone subreddit, which goes, "Why do I get amazing erections when I take my AI?" An aromatase inhibitor. Guy goes, "Morning, noon, anytime I want. If I don't take it for a week and a half, they stop. Erections stop. Yes, E2, but my TRT dose is only 30 milligrams every other day, and my estrogen isn't even out of range. Do I need TRT? Should I just take the eye? Seems like it's helping more than anything." Now, the funny thing about this is he goes, "Yeah, my dose is only 30 milligrams every other day." Here is a guy that is on low dose of testosterone. 30 milligrams every other day is a low dose. And again, he's saying estrogen isn't even out of range, right? But when he takes the AI and he reduces estrogen, hopefully just a little bit, because I'm not saying you should be eating anastrozole like it's candy, then suddenly the erections come back. Well, it's probably the E2 binding in the penile tissue, which is causing vascular issues and venous leakage and causing you to have ED. Again, I mean, there's a reference range for estradiol for a reason. So this notion that you can just modify your testosterone protocol by lowering the dose or increasing the frequency or going sub-Q and eating broccoli for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is wrong. Maybe it works for some guys, but it does not work for every guy. And it's not because they have a malfunctioning liver or they're in terrible shape otherwise and they're doing things that are wrong. It's not the case. It is that some men, whether they drink or not, whether they're overweight or not, whether they're insulin resistant or not, are going to aromatize a good degree of their testosterone to estrogen. You know, whether they manipulate their protocol, etc., 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 they're not going to be able to get around that. Sure, should you try to take DIM, you know, eat more cruciferous vegetables, not be insulin resistant, take care of your body otherwise, to reduce the necessity for the use of an aromatase inhibitor? Sure, because in the women who were taking a milligram a day, which we don't even come close to those of us on HRT, weren't on testosterone, that are postmenopausal women, so they're already, you know, kind of osteoporotic, if you will. They had over a 5 to 7 year period a small reduction in bone mineral density, which the use of high potency EPA and DHA could probably prevent. There's literature on that, as well as a compound called strontium. You know, you might want to consider taking that if you're even concerned about this, which has been shown very clearly to increase bone mineral density over the consistent usage of it over years. What is the bottom line here, folks? The bottom line is anything I've seen over the years, I've been around long enough doing biohacking and nootropics and consulting real men for many years to know that when there is a new faddish like vocal minority that's very, very loud, that are screaming about one thing or the other, they are usually wrong. I saw it happen with keto. Rob Wolf, Mark Sisson, who are the other folks? Their names are escaping me off the top of my head, but all of them walked back. Dave Asprey, consistent ketogenic diet, walked back their positions with this, what was very, very dogmatic approach to eating strictly fat and avoiding carbs because they'll kill you. You know, they all walked it back and brought some carbs back in. Paleo went from no carb to low carb to moderate carb to eating carbs. And this kind of stuff happens all the time. Like, I've been around to see all these different phases and watch them all change their minds on this stuff. And that is because when you're exceptionally dogmatic and counter what exists in literature or what exists as, you know, normal practice, you're very vocal about it, and then you have a bunch of people on the web that parrot that information in this regurgitative type of way, it is usually misguided. The problem is then you get people who follow the advice, they take these sort of simplistic phrases like you don't need to manage estrogen while on TRT, or you don't want to manage estrogen at all, and then they run into erectile issues, potentially high blood pressure, potentially the formulation of pituitary tumors. There are a lot of guys in the testosterone subreddit that have a terrible time on TRT because they're listening to this advice to never manage estrogen. You got guys that, you know, they take their aromatase inhibitor and they're just not quite understanding the terminal life, the active life, not just the half-life, but how long it's actually active in your system. And they keep dosing it, and then they crash their estrogen. Their estrogen's sitting at 16, they feel like crap. They're not dosing fish oil. They're not really concerned about anything relating to joint health. They're not doing anything. And then they go, AIs are bad. It's just not this simple, my friends, okay? For different men, there are going to be different estradiol levels that are going to be optimal for them. And yes, anastrozole, I will admit, the way that it comes, it's in too high doses, right? And you have to have a pill cutter to cut it down to reasonable doses for a lot of guys to get, you know, that kind of micro movement in estradiol enough to get your erection function back and for everything to function well. You know, that is an issue. You know, I mean, there's no real solution for that unless they start compounding or making anastrozole in 0.125 or even lower than that, you know, in small little tablets, so that guys can actually more accurately manage estradiol in a healthful way, keeping it in a range where you're still getting estrogen binding in the cardiac tissue, estrogen binding in the brain, your joints are healthy and functioning well, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so rarely are the loud, vocal, dogmatic internet warriors right on anything. I've been around long enough to do this. You can go find some of my content from 10 years ago when I was talking about biohacking, because I'm not just some guy who popped up out of nowhere that does IT in Quebec and wants to tell you how to manage your TRT protocol. Okay, I'm a person that follows the literature, but also takes into account anecdotal experiences and looks at the entirety of the situation and reads a lot of papers on both sides so that I'm not blindly missing something because of my dogma to ultimately formulate what ends up being the best possible route for a client or a person to go down. But ultimately understand that if you are on testosterone, for a good percentage of men, your testosterone, despite your dose and based on hosts of other factors relating to aromatization and other factors that are unknown, you're going to aromatize some of that testosterone into estrogen. And in order to function optimally, the best on TRT, which you can do with, managing estrogen and still be in good health, you might have to, okay? You might have to manage estrogen. And that's the point that I wanted to get across, as well as highlighting the erectile issues that come along with letting estrogen go out of control and run amok. You are on TRT and you're having a problem with erection function, or you're having a difficult time dialing the protocol in based on the information that you're being served on the web and by doctors, etc. But you need a little guidance on what you should do relating to your blood work or your erection issues or whatever issues you may having. You can hire me at livecortex.com. It's one of the major things I do. I'm a consultant that's been around for more than a decade that has been helping people on TRT, formulating nootropic stacks and a host of other things related to health and physiology for quite some time. So you can book an email consult with me, a call. You can do basically whatever you want. We got a bunch of options at livecortex.com. As I said at the beginning, I got a couple coupon codes. Well, I got one, which is 15 now. That'll save you 15% off of the Torque Nootropic stack or the Cortex stack. I mean, these are powerful, proven dopamine, energy, motivation, stimulation stacks. Both are powerful. Torque is more like 6 to 8 hours of clean stimulant energy. Cortex will give you stimulant energy, but it's also about improving verbal fluency, inducing brain fluidity, and making you generally function well in addition to being stimulated. You can get all those stacks or both of those stacks at livecortex.com. Nootropics guides. A lot of people that have a lot of questions on the live streams, which I really appreciate, but a lot of the answers to some of the questions that you have are in all of these guides. We wrote one about racetams. I wrote one about every nootropic in the book called Smarter, Better, Faster. That's an interactive audiobook. I wrote a stack list for business people, and I wrote a general stack list, a compilation of highly effective, done-for-you nootropic stacks. You can get all this stuff at livecortex.com. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you. Please subscribe to the channel if you appreciate anything that I said. Comment, like for the algorithm, and I'll chat with you on the next one.